"We only invited her out of pity," my daughter-in-law said, and the laughter that followed was soft enough to sound polite, but sharp enough to cut straight through my heart. I stopped in the hallway outside the dining room, my hand still resting on the brass doorknob. For a moment, I wondered if I had misheard her. At 72, my hearing was not what it used to be. But then another voice joined in. "At least she gets to be around people tonight." More laughter followed. I stood there quietly, staring at the polished hardwood floor beneath my feet. Then I adjusted the pearl necklace resting against my collarbone, lifted my chin, and walked into the room as though I had heard nothing at all. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and that night was supposed to be a celebration of family. The townhouse in Brooklyn Heights glowed with warm lights spilling from crystal chandeliers. Fresh white roses decorated every table. Expensive wine bottles stood arranged along a sideboard. Guests mingled with easy smiles while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. It looked like the kind of evening people remembered fondly years later. Yet the moment I stepped inside, I felt like a stranger. "Margaret," Stephanie called out brightly. Her smile was perfect. It always was when other people were watching. "You made it." I nodded. I wouldn't miss a family gathering. Her eyes flickered for a second before she turned back to her guests. "Everyone, this is Daniel's mother. Not Margaret. Not family matriarch. Not the woman who had spent decades building a life for her family. Just Daniel's mother." A title delivered as casually as a weather report. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and looked around the room. Every corner of that house held memories I knew by heart. The staircase where my late husband Harold had nearly fallen while hanging Christmas decorations. The fireplace where Daniel opened presents every December morning. The bay window where I once sat for hours sewing curtains with my own hands. Yet none of the guests seemed to realize I knew the house better than anyone there. They admired the architecture. They complimented the renovations. They congratulated Daniel and Stephanie on their beautiful home. Each compliment earned a proud smile from Stephanie. I simply listened. Eventually, I found my seat. It was a small chair tucked near the end of the room, far from the center of conversation. Not beside my son. Not beside my grandchildren. Near the doorway where servers entered and exited carrying trays. I sat down carefully and folded my hands in my lap. Across the room, Daniel laughed at something a guest said. For a brief moment, I hoped he would glance my way. He didn't. The evening carried on around me like a performance in which I no longer had a role. But as I watched Stephanie move confidently through the crowd, accepting compliments and speaking as though everything around her belonged to her, I felt something unexpected settle inside me. Not sadness, not anger, clarity. Because while everyone in that room believed I was there out of pity, none of them knew the truth. None of them knew whose house they were actually standing in. I remained in that chair for most of the evening, quietly observing the room around me. It was strange how invisible a person could become while sitting in plain sight. Guests walked past my table carrying drinks and appetizers, smiling politely before moving on to conversations they considered more important. Every few minutes, I heard someone compliment Stephanie on the house. She accepted every compliment with practiced ease. "Thank you. We have put so much work into making it feel like home." Each time she said those words, I felt a small ache deep inside my chest. Home. It was a simple word, but it carried decades of memories for me. I glanced toward the bay window near the front of the house. The curtains hanging there were different now, but I could still picture the original floral fabric Harold and I had chosen together almost 30 years earlier. Back then, Daniel was still a teenager. He used to sit by that same window after school, finishing homework while I prepared dinner in the kitchen. For a moment, I could almost hear the sound of his laughter echoing through the house the way it once had. The memory faded when Stephanie approached my table with two women I had never met. "This is Margaret," she said, "Daniel's mother." One of the women smiled warmly. "It is lovely to meet you." I returned the smile. "Likewise." Stephanie laughed softly and touched my shoulder. "Margaret does not come out very often these days. We always try to include her when we can." There was something about the way she said it that made me feel less like family and more like a community service project. The women exchanged polite expressions. I simply nodded and took a sip of water. Stephanie soon drifted away toward another group of guests, leaving me behind once again. As the evening continued, I noticed something else. Daniel rarely came near me. He was busy entertaining guests, discussing work opportunities, neighborhood developments, and future plans. Every now and then our eyes met across the room. Each time he offered a quick smile before turning away. Years ago, that would have broken my heart. Tonight it mostly made me tired. I had spent too many years making excuses for behavior that should never have needed excuses. Around 8 o'clock, dinner was served. Long platters of food covered the center of the dining table. Candlelight reflected across crystal glasses and polished silverware. Everyone found their assigned seats. Mine remained near the far end of the table. Not beside my son. Not beside my grandchildren. Far enough away that conversations reached me only in fragments. As I ate, I listened. People often reveal more than they intend when they believe someone is not paying attention. I learned that Daniel and Stephanie were discussing extensive renovations. They wanted to remove several original features of the house. They talked about opening walls, replacing woodwork, redesigning entire rooms. Stephanie spoke confidently about her vision for the property. "We want something more modern," she explained. "Something that reflects our future." A guest asked how long they planned to stay. Stephanie smiled. "Forever, hopefully. This house will eventually belong to our children." Several guests nodded approvingly. Daniel raised his glass in agreement. I looked down at my plate and carefully folded my napkin. Neither of them hesitated. Neither of them corrected the assumption. In that moment, I realized something important. It was not merely that they had forgotten the truth. They had become comfortable rewriting it. The house had slowly transformed from a gift of temporary shelter into something they genuinely believed was theirs. And perhaps that was the greatest danger of entitlement. Given enough time, people stop recognizing generosity and begin treating it as an obligation. I lifted my eyes toward the portrait of Harold hanging above the fireplace. His calm expression seemed unchanged despite everything that had happened since he was gone. Looking at that familiar face, I felt the same clarity return. The evening was revealing exactly what I needed to see. No arguments. No confrontations. Just truth quietly exposing itself, one conversation at a time. After dinner, guests drifted back into smaller groups throughout the house. Some gathered around the fireplace. Others stood near the windows overlooking the quiet Brooklyn street below. The soft music continued playing in the background, blending with the hum of conversation. I remained seated for a while, watching the evening unfold. There was a strange comfort in simply observing people when they believed no one was paying attention. Masks tend to slip when individuals feel secure. Stephanie moved through the room like a hostess accepting admiration she believed she had earned. Every compliment seemed to make her stand a little taller. "You have done such an incredible job with this place," one woman told her. Stephanie smiled brightly. "Thank you. It has taken years to get everything exactly the way we wanted." The words settled heavily in the air. Years. That was true. It had taken years. Just not in the way she meant. I remembered the countless weekends Harold and I spent restoring the townhouse after we bought it. Back then, many people thought we were foolish. The building needed work. The roof leaked during storms. The plumbing had a habit of creating surprises at the worst possible moments. Yet Harold loved its character. He always said old houses rewarded patience. Together we painted walls, refinished floors, repaired fixtures, and slowly transformed the property into a home. Those memories felt more vivid than the party happening around me. A burst of laughter pulled me back to the present. Daniel was standing with a group of guests near the dining room. One of the men asked him how long he had owned the townhouse. "Almost 10 years now," Daniel replied casually. "It has become a big part of our lives." My eyes lifted toward him. The statement was not entirely false. He had lived there for years. He had raised his children there. But something about the ease with which he answered bothered me. There was no hesitation, no acknowledgement that the story was more complicated than that. It was as if the truth had slowly faded from his memory until he no longer recognized its absence. A little later, I wandered toward the library. It had once been Harold's favorite room. Most guests ignored it because it was quieter than the rest of the house. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls. A reading lamp cast a warm glow over an old leather chair in the corner. I ran my fingers lightly across the edge of a bookshelf and smiled. Some things had survived the renovations. "Margaret," a familiar voice said behind me. I turned and immediately recognized Arthur Bennett. His hair was completely white now, but his posture remained straight and confident. Arthur had been Harold's attorney for nearly 3 decades. He had handled business matters, estate planning, and more than a few family emergencies over the years. "Arthur," I said warmly. It has been a long time. Far too long, he replied. We exchanged a few pleasantries before his expression shifted slightly. He glanced toward the crowded living room and then back at me. May I ask you something? Of course. Arthur lowered his voice. Do Daniel and Stephanie understand the ownership structure of this property? The question caught me off guard, though perhaps it should not have. Arthur was one of the few people who knew every detail. I studied his face carefully. Why do you ask? He paused. Because I have spent the entire evening listening to conversations that suggest they believe this house belongs to them. I looked past him, toward the gathering guests. Perhaps they do believe that. Arthur frowned. That could become a problem. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The distant sound of laughter echoed from the next room. Finally, I offered a small smile. Problems usually reveal themselves when people become too comfortable. Arthur held my gaze. Then he nodded slowly. Harold always admired your patience. The mention of my husband brought a familiar ache, but also a sense of calm. Harold had understood something many people never learn. Character reveals itself over time. Not during crises. Not during celebrations. During ordinary moments when people think their choices carry no consequences. As Arthur returned to the party, I remained alone in the library for several minutes. Through the doorway, I could see Stephanie standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of wine and laughing confidently. She looked completely at ease, completely certain of her position. Watching her, I realized the evening was moving towards something inevitable. The assumptions that had been quietly growing for years were no longer hidden. They were being spoken aloud in front of witnesses. And once truth begins revealing itself, it rarely stops halfway. When I stepped out of the library, the atmosphere in the house had shifted slightly. The evening was moving into that stage where people became more relaxed, more comfortable, and far less careful with their words. Empty glasses appeared on tables. Conversations grew louder. Small groups blended together. The polished image of the perfect gathering was beginning to crack around the edges. I slowly walked through the hallway toward the living room, passing photographs displayed along the wall. Most of them had been replaced over the years. Pictures of Daniel and Stephanie's vacations. School portraits of the children. Holiday snapshots. Yet one photograph remained. A picture of Harold and me standing on the front steps the day we finished restoring the townhouse. We looked younger then. Tired, certainly, but proud. I paused for a moment before continuing. Near the fireplace, a circle of guests had gathered around Stephanie. She seemed to enjoy being the center of attention. As I approached, I heard someone ask how she and Daniel had managed to secure such a valuable property in Brooklyn. Real estate prices had climbed dramatically over the years. The townhouse was worth far more now than when Harold and I purchased it. Stephanie smiled and crossed her arms confidently. A lot of hard work and smart decisions, she replied. Daniel and I have invested years into this place. Several people nodded approvingly. Then another guest laughed and said, Well, your children will be set for life one day. That is the plan, Stephanie answered without hesitation. Everything here will stay in the family. I noticed Arthur standing across the room. He heard the exchange too. Our eyes met briefly. Neither of us said anything. There was no need. The truth was sitting quietly between us. A few minutes later, dessert was served. Plates of cheesecake and chocolate torte appeared throughout the room. I accepted a small slice and found a seat near one of the windows. Outside, the city lights stretched across the dark evening. Cars moved steadily below. Life continued as it always did, indifferent to family dramas unfolding behind closed doors. As I sat there, memories surfaced one after another. Not dramatic memories. Small ones. The kind that shape a family over decades. I remembered the day Daniel arrived at my door 11 years earlier. His business had struggled. Debt was piling up. He looked exhausted. Stephanie was worried. The children were still young. Just for a few months, Mom, he had said. Until we get back on our feet. I had not needed time to think about it. He was my son. Of course I opened the door. Of course I told them they could stay. At the time, Harold had already passed away. The house felt too quiet without him. Having family nearby seemed like a blessing. The first months passed peacefully. Then months became years. Gradually, small changes appeared. New furniture replaced old furniture. Rooms were redecorated. Decisions were made without asking me. At first I dismissed it. Families evolve. People adapt. But looking back now, I realized something important. The changes were not only happening to the house. They were happening to my place within it. Slowly, almost invisibly, I had been moved further and further to the edge of my own life. Margaret, the voice interrupted my thoughts. I looked up to find Daniel standing beside me. Everything all right? He asked. You have been pretty quiet tonight. I studied his face. He seemed sincere enough. Yet there was distance there too. A distance that had grown over many years. I am fine, I replied. Just thinking. He nodded and glanced around the room. Stephanie worked hard to put this together. I can see that. He smiled. She wants everyone to feel welcome. For a moment, I almost laughed at the irony. Instead, I simply looked back toward the crowded room. Guests filled every corner of the house. They talked, laughed, and celebrated beneath a roof they believed belonged to someone else. And for the first time all evening, I began to wonder what would happen when that misunderstanding finally met reality. The evening continued drifting forward, and with every passing minute I felt less like a guest and more like an observer attending a performance whose ending had already been written. The conversations grew louder. The laughter became easier. People who had arrived as strangers now spoke like old friends. Meanwhile, I sat quietly near the window, watching the reflections of city lights shimmer against the glass. A young couple standing nearby began discussing real estate values in Brooklyn. One of them remarked that the townhouse alone was probably worth several $1,000,000. Your family made a smart investment, the woman said as she glanced toward Daniel and Stephanie. Properties like this are impossible to find now. I noticed Stephanie overhear the comment. Her smile widened immediately. We have been very fortunate, she replied. This house has given us so many opportunities. There it was again. Not a lie exactly, just a carefully polished version of reality. Over the years, I had learned that some of the most dangerous misunderstandings begin with a small omission. Leave out enough pieces of the truth, and eventually people stop noticing what is missing. I watched several guests gather around. Stephanie, as she described future plans for the property. She talked about expanding the kitchen. She mentioned redesigning the third floor. She even joked about turning one of the older rooms into a private wine lounge. Everyone seemed impressed. No one questioned whether she had the authority to make those decisions. Why would they? She spoke with complete confidence. Confidence has a way of convincing people that ownership and entitlement are the same thing. As the conversations unfolded, another memory surfaced. A difficult winter nearly 8 years earlier. Daniel had lost a major client. Bills were piling up faster than he could pay them. One evening, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, looking defeated. I remembered the worry in his eyes. I remembered the embarrassment in his voice when he asked for help. I had transferred money from my savings account without hesitation. Not because I expected repayment. Not because I wanted gratitude. I did it because he was my son. That was what family meant to me. Looking around the room now, I wondered when that understanding had changed. When had support become expectation? When had generosity become obligation? A burst of applause interrupted my thoughts. Stephanie had climbed the small platform near the dining room where a microphone had been set up earlier. She tapped the microphone gently and smiled as conversations faded. Thank you all for coming tonight, she began. Guests turned their attention toward her. Daniel joined her side, looking pleased. This house has been the center of so many wonderful memories for our family, Stephanie continued. We are grateful for everyone who has supported us over the years. More applause followed. I noticed Arthur standing near the back of the room, his expression unreadable. Stephanie continued speaking, sharing stories about holidays, birthdays, and family gatherings. Most of what she said sounded harmless. Then her tone shifted slightly. Family is about making room for everyone, she said, even when it requires patience and compassion. Several guests nodded. That is why we always try to include everyone, no matter the circumstances. Her eyes briefly moved. In my direction. The gesture lasted only a second, but it was enough. A few people glanced toward me before looking away. The message had been delivered exactly as intended. Subtle, polite, public. I felt no anger. Surprisingly, I felt something closer to relief. After years of small dismissals hidden behind smiles and careful wording, everything was finally visible. Not only to me, to everyone. The room filled with applause once more as Stephanie finished her remarks. She stepped down from the platform looking proud of herself. Daniel squeezed her hand. Guests congratulated them. Through it all, I remained seated. Quiet, calm, certain, because for the first time that evening, I realized I no longer needed to wonder whether I was imagining things. The truth had revealed itself completely. And once a person sees the truth clearly, it becomes impossible to look away. The applause slowly faded, and conversations resumed throughout the house. Yet something had changed for me. The uncertainty was gone. For years I had questioned my own instincts. I had convinced myself that perhaps I was being overly sensitive. Perhaps I was misinterpreting things. Perhaps the distance between us was simply part of growing older. But now I understood that what I had witnessed was not carelessness. It was a pattern built one small decision at a time. I rose from my chair and walked toward the kitchen for a glass of water. The room was quieter than the rest of the house. Through the doorway, I could still hear laughter from the living room. As I stood by the counter, Arthur entered carrying an empty coffee cup. He glanced toward the hallway before speaking. "You handled that speech better than most people would have." I smiled faintly. Age teaches patience. Arthur set down his cup. Patience is useful. So is timing. I looked at him carefully. "You seem concerned." "I am observant," he replied. "There is a difference." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Arthur lowered his voice. "A few guests asked me questions tonight. They assumed Daniel and Stephanie own the property. Apparently, they have been presenting it that way for quite some time." I stared at the kitchen window above the sink. Outside, the city lights reflected against the glass. I suspected as much. Arthur folded his arms. "The deed remains exactly as Harold intended." "I know, and there have never been any changes." "I know that too." He nodded slowly. "Then you understand the position you are in." His words lingered in the quiet kitchen. The position I was in. It was strange hearing it described that way. For years I had thought of myself as a mother trying to keep peace within her family. Yet legally, practically, and morally, the situation looked very different. I was not the dependent guest Stephanie described. I was not someone surviving on the kindness of others. The foundation beneath everything they enjoyed still rested where it always had. Arthur seemed satisfied by my silence. "Harold trusted your judgment," he said. "More than anyone." Hearing my husband's name spoken aloud brought a familiar warmth. Harold had never been impulsive. He believed important decisions should be made slowly and carefully. Looking back, I realized he had left me more than a house. He had left me options. Arthur eventually returned to the party, leaving me alone with my thoughts. A few minutes later, I stepped back into the living room. The gathering had become even more relaxed. Several guests were discussing travel plans. Others exchanged business cards. Near the fireplace, Stephanie was once again holding court. As I approached, I overheard part of her conversation. "The children will probably inherit everything eventually," she was saying. "That is the long-term plan." A man beside her nodded. "That must be comforting." "It is," Stephanie replied. "We have worked hard to build a future here." I noticed Daniel standing nearby. He did not correct her. He did not add context. He simply listened. Watching them together, I felt a surprising sense of calm. Not because their assumptions were correct, because they were finally being spoken openly. Hidden beliefs lose their power once they are brought into the light. One of the guests suddenly turned toward me. "Margaret," he said warmly, "you must be proud. They have created a wonderful life for themselves." I looked at Daniel, then at Stephanie. Finally, I smiled politely. "Yes," I said. "It is remarkable what people can build when someone gives them a place to start." The guest laughed, assuming I meant encouragement. Only Arthur, standing across the room, seemed to understand the deeper meaning. He lifted his glass slightly in my direction. I returned the gesture. The evening was approaching its final hours. Most of the guests still believed they understood the story of this house. They believed they knew who had built it, who controlled it, and who would decide its future. They were wrong about all three. And very soon, that misunderstanding would become impossible to ignore. By 10 o'clock, the gathering had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Some guests had already left, while others lingered over coffee and dessert. The atmosphere felt relaxed, almost celebratory. If someone had walked into the house at that moment, they would have seen a successful family enjoying a beautiful evening together. They would never have guessed how much had been left unsaid beneath the surface. I stood near the fireplace, studying the old mantel Harold and I had restored years ago. The wood still carried faint marks from the original craftsmanship. I remembered spending entire weekends working beside him, carefully preserving details that other people barely noticed. Harold always believed character revealed itself in the details. Looking around the room, I realized he had been right. The details were revealing everything. A conversation near the dining room caught my attention. Stephanie was speaking with several guests who seemed fascinated by her plans for the property. The next project is the third floor, she explained. The old guest room is wasted space. One of the guests asked what she intended to do with it. Stephanie laughed lightly. Honestly, I have been thinking about turning it into a wine room or maybe a private lounge. The group nodded approvingly. Then someone asked whether the room had sentimental value for anyone in the family. Not really, Stephanie replied. It is just an extra room. I felt a small sadness pass through me. That room had once belonged to Daniel. I remembered reading bedtime stories there when he was 7 years old. I remembered helping him decorate it before his first year of high school. I remembered sitting beside his bed after he received his college acceptance letter. To Stephanie, it was simply unused square footage. To me, it held decades of memories. Yet even that realization no longer hurt the way it once would have. Instead, it clarified something important. People value differently what they inherit and what they earn. A little later, Daniel joined the conversation. One guest joked that he was lucky to have secured such a valuable property in New York. Daniel smiled and raised his coffee cup. Trust me, we plan to keep it in the family for generations. The comment was met with enthusiastic agreement. Several people began discussing future renovations, property appreciation, and long-term family wealth. It was remarkable how confidently everyone spoke about a future they assumed was already decided. Then Stephanie said something that changed the entire tone of the evening. The children will never have to worry, she said proudly. Everything here will eventually belong to them. This house is our legacy. Her words carried across the room. Conversations quieted slightly as people listened. She stood there smiling, completely certain of herself. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then a guest raised a glass and offered a toast. To family legacy. Glasses lifted throughout the room. Daniel smiled. Stephanie looked delighted. I noticed Arthur standing near the staircase. He slowly lowered his eyes and shook his head almost imperceptibly. The gesture lasted less than a second, but I understood exactly what it meant. Legacy. Ownership. Entitlement. They were speaking as though the future had already been guaranteed. As though the decisions belonged exclusively to them. As though the person who actually held those decisions no longer mattered. I took a slow sip of water and studied the room around me. Nobody noticed. Nobody questioned the assumptions being repeated from one conversation to the next. The misunderstanding had become so complete that it now functioned as accepted fact. Yet the more they talked, the calmer I became. Every word made the situation clearer. Every confident prediction brought them closer to a reality they had never considered. Because the truth was no longer hidden. The truth was sitting quietly in the room, listening patiently while everyone else told themselves a story that was about to come to an end. The evening was beginning to wind down when the moment finally arrived. Guests were gathering coats, exchanging phone numbers, and lingering near the front hallway. The energy had shifted from celebration to reflection. Conversations were softer now, more personal. People were no longer trying to impress one another. They were simply enjoying the final moments of a successful evening. At least, that was how most of them saw it. I was standing near the staircase when I heard Stephanie laughing with a small group near the dining room. The next renovation is definitely happening this year, she said confidently. I have already started collecting ideas. One of the guests asked which area she planned to renovate first. Stephanie smiled. The third floor. There are rooms up there that serve no purpose anymore. We are finally going to make better use of the space. Several people nodded. Another guest asked whether the project would be expensive. Daniel answered before she could. It will be an investment, but it is worth it. This house is our future. I noticed Arthur standing a few feet away. He was listening carefully. So was I? Then Stephanie laughed and added something that caused several guests to smile. Honestly, I should have done it years ago. Some people get attached to old memories, but houses have to evolve. She glanced briefly in my direction. The message was subtle, but impossible to miss. The room became very quiet inside my mind. Not angry, not emotional, simply quiet. I looked around at the faces gathered throughout the room. Most of them seemed pleasant, decent people. They had spent the entire evening listening to a version of reality that nobody had challenged. They had no reason to question it. They believed they were standing inside Daniel and Stephanie's home. They believed they were listening to its owners discuss its future. And that was precisely why the truth needed to be spoken aloud. I set my glass down on a nearby table and walked calmly toward the group. My heels made soft sounds against the hardwood floor. A few conversations stopped as people noticed me approaching. Stephanie smiled politely. "Margaret, are you ready to head home?" The question hung in the air. For a brief moment, nobody moved. I looked at her and returned a small smile of my own. "Actually," I said quietly, "there is something I have been meaning to clarify." The room grew noticeably still. Daniel looked confused. Stephanie blinked. I turned toward the guests. "You have all been incredibly kind this evening. I would hate for anyone to leave with the wrong impression." Several people exchanged curious glances. "The townhouse has been discussed quite a bit tonight," I continued. "Its future, its renovations, its legacy." Nobody interrupted. "There seems to be a misunderstanding." Stephanie's smile faded slightly. Daniel shifted his weight. I kept my voice calm. "The property was never transferred." Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Genuine silence. The kind that appears when people suddenly realize they may have missed an important piece of information. I looked toward Arthur. He stepped forward without hesitation. "Margaret is correct," he said. "The ownership documents remain exactly as they have for years." Several guests stared at him. Others looked back at me. Daniel's expression changed first, then Stephanie's. For the first time all evening, neither of them seemed certain what to say. I felt no satisfaction in their discomfort, only clarity. Years of assumptions had collided with a single fact. Nothing more, nothing less. I looked around the room one final time. "I have always been happy to share my home with family," I said. "But sharing something and surrendering it are not the same thing." No one spoke. No one laughed. No one argued. The truth required none of those things. It simply existed. And standing there in the house Harold and I had built together, I finally felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Seen. No one spoke for several seconds after that. The silence spread through the room slowly, settling over every conversation and every unfinished thought. Guests who had been preparing to leave now stood motionless, holding coats and handbags. Daniel looked at me as though he was seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Stephanie's confident expression had disappeared completely. The certainty she had carried throughout the evening seemed to drain away all at once. Arthur remained calm beside the staircase. He did not need to argue. Facts rarely require raised voices. Eventually, one of the guests cleared his throat and quietly excused himself. Then another followed. Within minutes, people began saying their goodbyes. The energy that had filled the house earlier was gone. Not because anyone had caused a scene, because reality had entered the room and left no space for assumptions. I stood near the fireplace while guests filed toward the front door. Several stopped to speak with me before leaving. Their words were polite, respectful. A few seemed embarrassed on behalf of what they had witnessed. I thanked them for coming and wished them safe travels home. That was all. By 11 o'clock, only a handful of people remained. Then they too departed. Eventually, the front door closed behind the final guest, and the house became quiet. For the first time all evening, it felt familiar again. The silence reminded me of the years after Harold and I first moved in. Back then, quiet had never felt lonely. It had felt peaceful. I looked around the living room. Empty glasses sat on tables. Dessert plates remained scattered across the dining room. Candle flames flickered softly in the distance. The evening was over. Daniel finally approached me. His shoulders seemed heavier than they had earlier. "Mom," he said quietly. I turned toward him. He opened his mouth as if searching for the right words. None came. Perhaps there were no easy words left. "I did not realize," he said at last. I studied his face. There was regret there. Confusion too. But also something else. Recognition. The slow understanding that certain lines had been crossed long ago. "That is part of the problem," I replied gently. He lowered his eyes. Across the room, Stephanie remained near the dining table. She said nothing. For once, there were no speeches. No explanations. No carefully crafted comments. Only silence. I walked toward the front window and looked out at the city lights beyond the glass. "When your father and I bought this house," I said, "we dreamed about filling it with family. We wanted laughter here. Birthdays, holidays, grandchildren running through the hallways." Daniel listened quietly. "And for many years, that is exactly what happened." I paused. But somewhere along the way, gratitude turned into expectation. The room remained still. "I never minded helping family," I continued. I never minded sharing my home. What I minded was becoming invisible inside it. Those words seemed to land harder than anything else I had said that night. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I felt no satisfaction from his discomfort, only sadness for what had been lost. After a long silence, I spoke again. You and Stephanie will have 30 days to make other arrangements. Neither of them argued. Neither of them protested. Perhaps they understood there was nothing left to debate. The decision was calm, reasonable, final. I picked up my coat from the chair near the door. Before heading upstairs, I glanced once more around the room. The house looked exactly the same as it had a few hours earlier. The furniture had not changed. The walls had not changed. The photographs had not changed. Yet everything felt different. Not because I had reclaimed ownership. Ownership had never left me. What changed was something far more important. I had finally stopped shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. As I climbed the staircase toward my room, I felt unexpectedly light. The future was uncertain. Families are complicated. Healing takes time. But for the first time in years, I was no longer living as a guest in my own life. And that was worth more than any house could ever be.